happening in a country under siege.
This election offers an opportunity to move away from violence and uncertainty toward peace and representative government.
Democracy takes hold. Does it have a chance to flourish? On News and Review today, election in Iraq. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. There were some serious doubts about whether the Iraqi election would even happen. Many thought it would have to be delayed. They said Iraq was too dangerous for democracy. They warned that the divisions in the country were too deep and that the voters would stay home. Well, it was dangerous, but the voters didn't stay home, and the result was something remarkable. The last national vote in Iraq was held back in 2002. There was only one name on the ballot that time, Saddam Hussein. It wasn't exactly an exercise in democracy. In 2005, there were more than 7,000 candidates for more than 100 parties. This was real democracy. But it was happening in a country devastated by a violent and bloody insurgency. CBC reporter Don Murray was in Baghdad on voting day.
The day began as predicted in blood. Mortars rained down, bombs, human bombs, blew up. This was the aftermath of a mortar attack in Baghdad's Sadr city. At least 4 people were killed, several more were injured. The explosion shattered cars. It was one of a dozen attacks in the capital. The insurgents had vowed to strike terror into voters. But for many Iraqis, this day was a chance to offer their answer to violence. They, like we, had to walk, or in the case of the old, be pushed to the polling station. Car travel was banned to cut the risk of suicide bombs. Despite a morning of mortars, bombs, and death, Iraqis in Baghdad seemed undeterred, even enthusiastic, as they streamed in to vote. Sheikh Badr Karim Abu Khaytem came with his 2 wives to cast his ballot. Like millions of others, he dipped his index finger in ink to offer a fingerprint as proof of identity. We're very happy, he says. This is a great day for freedom. It's not like before, when we were forced to vote for just one man, Saddam Hussein. An old, almost blind man also came, despite the fact that a leaflet had been shoved under his door yesterday warning he'd be killed if he voted. Iraqi guards watched over empty streets. Polling stations were surrounded by security. The police and National Guardsmen also offered political advice, urging many voters here to choose the party of interim Prime Minister Ayad Alawi. Many voters shared the conviction offered by this armed officer. I voted today, he says, to prove that I'm not afraid of terrorists and of car bombs. Others had slightly different reasons. I came here in order to save our country from the occupation, she says. We need a new national government. We need to change everything. The long lineups in the Shiite city of Basra in the south testified to the same desire for change. The Shiites are the majority in the country, but the government has long been dominated by Sunni leaders. Shiites were hoping to elect a government for the first time run by leaders of the majority. The picture was much emptier in Sunni cities. Sunni political and religious leaders had called on their followers to boycott the vote, which they described as rushed and unfair. Most Sunnis stayed away from the voting booth. Despite the boycott, the overall turnout appeared to be solid. The voters had stared down the insurgents. It was their first gift to their new government and the first competitive elections in Iraq in 50 years.
The official turnout was about 58%. More than solid. Amazing, really. In the last Canadian election, the turnout wasn't much better, just about 61%, and that was without any human bombs. It took weeks to count all the votes in Iraq, and when the tally was done, a party called the United Iraqi Alliance had won the most seats. Who are they? Here's how George Strombolopoulos explained it on his program, The Hour.
The United Iraqi Alliance is actually a coalition of 20 Shia parties with the blessing of Iraq's top Shia cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani. The alliance won 48% of the vote, and that translates into a majority in parliament, 140 seats in all. The biggest player in the alliance is the Islamic Dawah Party. It's one of the oldest Shia parties, and it was exiled to Iran when Saddam Hussein was in power. The leader of that party is Ibrahim al-Jafari. Now, he's considered to be the front runner to become Iraq's prime minister and run the day-to-day government. He's considered a moderate, but his party's platform is conservative. Now, even though the Shia alliance has a majority in parliament, it still needs to make deals with other parties, because for a bill to pass, it needs a 2/3 majority. The Shia's key partner could be the Kurds. A bloc of Kurdish parties finished second in the election. They won 26% of the vote, giving them 75 seats. A group led by interim Prime Minister Ayad Alawi came third. Well, Alawi was the guy that the U.S. chose as PM, but his group, well, they just got 40 seats. The biggest losers, though, were the Sunnis. Most of them boycotted the election or were just too afraid to vote. So a big challenge now is making sure the Sunnis are represented fairly.
George Stroumboulopoulos explaining what the election was about. Now the question is, what do the watershed results mean for the future of the country? CBC correspondent Brian Stewart has more on that.
Rarely in modern history have so many expected so little of an election. Insurgents had vowed bloodbath and chaos. Much of the outside world dismissed the vote as unworkable. Yet, millions of Iraqis dismissed critics and death threats to vote. Taking a so-called first step towards democracy that was shaky and flawed, but still stronger than expected.
Very, very happy today. Very, very happy.
Given the continuing violence in Iraq, a decision to vote had to represent extraordinary hope that life will improve, insists a leading expert on Iraqi security, Peter Khalil.
Iraqis have always had this amazing optimism about the future of their country, even in the midst of the terrorism and the bombings and the mass casualty killings that have gone on in the last 2 years by Zarqawi and the other insurgents. And certainly the election, I have no doubt, give Iraqis greater optimism about the future for their country. And you'll see participation not just from the Kurds and the Shia, but obviously from the Sunnis.
Post-voting euphoria and heightened optimism. Sounds refreshing coming from so battered a nation. But these alone will not be enough to pull off the immensely difficult task of actually building a democracy. Shiites and Kurds in the north voted heavily. The once dominant Sunnis did not. And unless brought on side, Sunnis, the chief backers of the insurgency, could still scuttle progress. Robin Wright is a leading writer on Mideast affairs.
If they can't agree to a constitution by the middle of August, then the elections they have at the end of the year, instead of being for a permanent government, will be for another National Assembly to start the whole process of writing a constitution over from scratch. There are a lot of moments where this could begin to unravel.
So how to prevent this unraveling? There seem three priorities. Bring the Sunnis into the process. Contain the insurgency by strengthening Iraq's own ability to defend itself. And third, improve the lot of average Iraqis before they lose that sense of hope. An encouraging early sign is that Shiite and Kurdish leaders are offering Sunnis a place at the power-sharing table that may be hard for moderates to resist. As for security, the Americans are now belatedly trying to build up sizable and credible Iraqi counterinsurgency forces. Training has improved, but it will be many months before their value is known. In the meantime, the Iraqi authorities hope the large vote will demoralize more moderate insurgency groups and isolate the more extreme ones. But no one expects an early end to fighting.
And the fighting has not stopped, but the violence hasn't stopped the political process either. The parties have been negotiating a power-sharing arrangement. Against the mounting toll and the terrible odds, democracy and self-determination are taking hold. But as we've heard, the risks are still great. There's much to be done, and as you watch the story develop, here's something to keep in mind. For journalists, the Iraqi story has been very difficult to tell. The best journalism takes you as close as possible to the stories. But that really hasn't been possible in Iraq. It's been too dangerous, not just for the journalists, but also for the people who talk to them. And that affects how the Iraqi story is told. Here's what the last trip was like for Don Murray and his CBC crew.
For journalists, Baghdad is a war zone and increasingly perilous. Perhaps fittingly, we flew in on a British military transport plane. We landed in the dark, 3 hours late due to security concerns. We were lashed by sheets of winter rain. This mud zone was Camp Victory, the immense American military base that surrounds the airport. Our team, myself, producer Heather Abbott, cameraman Richard Deavy, and Chris Cobb-Smith and Mick Fox, our two security advisors, had to manhandle our bags and equipment across barbed wire, load up our cars, and then drive into the city down a highway road frequently targeted by insurgents. On this foul night, the insurgents stayed home. This was our goal, the fortress, the Palestine Hotel. It used to be a vantage point. Just across the street on Firdaus Square, the coalition invasion symbolically ended with the toppling of Saddam Hussein's statue. Now, surrounded by razor wire, blast walls, American soldiers, and Iraqi security men who call themselves the Babylon Eagles, it is a refuge. Western journalists in this unsettling environment are now partly observers and partly prisoners. Several have been kidnapped, a couple have been killed, and all of us are now potential targets. The temptation in the circumstances is to practice hotel journalism. Sit up there, check the news wires, phone around, and let someone else take the risks. If you do want to go out, you have to plan ahead.
Just to be absolutely sure, then we'll park the cars outside the checkpoint.
Every trip is an educated gamble. Our security advisors, Chris and Mick, check the map and discuss the route beforehand with our driver and fixer, Ali Manati.
On the left-hand side of the road or the right?
For Westerners, the Iraqi capital is now a place full of no-go zones, notably Adamiyah, a Sunni neighborhood where insurgents frequently roam. A trip to do an interview begins with quasi-military preparations, a check for car bombs, the donning of bulletproof vests, and for the security advisors, the preparation of weapons. 9 months ago, this seemed wildly exaggerated. 6 months ago, we still traveled unarmed. Now, most major news organizations go out this way, if they go out at all.
Chris, Mick, radio check.
And where, in other danger zones of the past, the practice was to tape the letters TV as big as possible to the car as a badge of benevolent neutrality, now the ideal is to travel anonymously in a dirty, used vehicle, preferably armor-plated. It's cold consolation to know that many of the people we want to see take even more precautions. Most are literally barricaded in, and with good reason. Dr. Salama al-Khattaji is one of the highest-profile women in the country. She ran as a candidate on the main Shiite party list. She never goes out except surrounded by a phalanx of bodyguards. Twice in recent months, she's been attacked by insurgents. Her son and a bodyguard were killed in one attack.
If I want to stop sometimes or threaten it so much, I look for backwards and I see the voice of my bodyguard and my son.
In this way, we've been able to get out almost every day. The ideal is to get out fast, get in and do the interview, and drive back quickly. But traffic, horrendous traffic, frequently conspires to prevent this. Traffic and soldiers, American and Iraqi. From day to day, they block key intersections and key roads to make life difficult for the insurgents and for everyone else. Getting blocked in a 20-minute traffic jam is our worst nightmare. Well, not exactly the worst. One possible consequence of driving around is getting too close to a car bomb and its aftermath. This scene was in fact shot by an Iraqi news agency cameraman. It's one thing to do an interview inside, away from hostile eyes. It's quite another to work on the street. We usually don't. Like other TV networks, we found an Iraqi cameraman, Abu Saif, who along with Ali went out to shoot street scenes and interviews on the sidewalk. Ironically, one of the few times we did get out on the street was on election day itself. There were no cars allowed, so we walked to a nearby polling station and talked to people. The bleakest irony is that the worst trip of all is to the Green Zone, the great palace fortress built for Saddam and in which the Iraqi government and the Americans do business. It's just across the river, but to drive there takes 45 minutes. Then you must get out and walk in. The last time we did it, just before the vote, it took 1 hour and 25 minutes through 5 checkpoints. This endurance test was to get press passes. 3 days of waiting and form filling to get these. One from the Americans, one from the Iraqi Ministry of the Interior, and one from the Iraqi Electoral Commission. And these two were completely useless. And what about our daily excursions? How useful were they? Well, in my view, not only useful, but almost essential. Iraqi senior people want to talk to the outside world. They appreciate the danger and the trouble we went to talk to them, and our reports were immeasurably improved by their insights. But each day we had to ask ourselves the same question. How big a risk are we willing to take to get this story?
Our crew, of course, can return to their safe homes. The safety of the Iraqis they met will depend on the political process now underway. And that's News in Review. I'm Carla Robinson. Thanks for watching. Holocaust horror.
They could and they did murder 8,000 to 10,000 people a day.
60 years after this Nazi death camp was liberated, a ceremony to honor the dead. And a promise to never let it happen again. On News in Review today, return to Auschwitz. Hello, I'm Carla Robinson. It was January 27th, 1945. The Second World War was still raging in Europe. In southwestern Poland, Soviet Red Army soldiers were driving Hitler's Nazi troops back towards Germany when they came across a huge concentration camp called Auschwitz. What they found when they entered the camp would shock them and the world and would make Auschwitz the single most powerful symbol of the terrible crime known as the Holocaust. This January, some of the survivors and some of the liberators joined world leaders at a ceremony to mark the 60th anniversary of the camp's liberation. The CBC's Alison Smith was there and prepared this report for News in Review on the death camp and the monstrous evil that led to its creation.